September 16th to our 28th, right, meeting of the CAUTAC. Thanks for joining us on a Tuesday. I know it's a little bit different, different day of the week, so thanks for accommodating the schedule. So last meeting, we feel like I have my wrong notes up here. Anyway, last meeting we talked about UGB exchanges and urban reserves, I believe. And if you recall, prior to that, we talked about Goal 10. We took a holistic view at Goal 10. Today, we're going to start off. Jenna's going to lead us through a kind of holistic review of the Goal 10 to Goal 14 and the relationship between Divisions 8 and 24. And then we'll review some of the work we've done to date in Division 24. And I believe that to help frame that discussion, that Jenna, you're kicking us off with our racial equity framework focus area. No, Maddie's got it. Sorry about that.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to open the meeting with the racial equity framework focus area related to restorative justice. In keeping with the topics that are on the docket today for your consideration, included in that are consultation with tribal members, particularly folks who over generations have seen the land that we now call Oregon transformed in just a short period of time, from what they knew to what they see now. And we'd like to also understand the cultural significance of areas that are considered within the process of cities growing and the management of that growth. In keeping with that, we'd like to talk a little bit more over this afternoon's conversation about how we include voices in this next iteration of urban growth boundary work. In particular, to reduce or mitigate further harm, and to learn from the people who potentially know the land the best. And that's not exclusive necessarily to folks who are indigenous to the area, but maybe the folks who have lived in certain areas for a very long time, and how we bring their voices into the process of both studying and expanding areas that a city may urbanize. So we're hoping that there are some meaningful ways that we can bring those voices into the decision-making process to ensure that we follow through with some of the promises or some of the trade-offs, the ways that we make compromises to allow a city to grow into areas that it has not yet urbanized. So thanks for considering that question and considering how racial equity might apply to some of the topics that we're likely to discuss this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Maddie. All right. Before Jenna takes us through that kind of review of Goal 14, just to note that within Division 24, some of the topics that on our agenda are shifting a little bit. So we won't be following the agenda exactly, but I'm sure you'll all be able to follow along, and we'll talk more about that when we get there. So Jenna, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and happy Tuesday, everyone. Good to see you. So this is a graphic. I can't remember if we've showed this before. We've shared this in RAC that really just reviews the relationship between Goal 10 and Goal 14. And I know you all probably don't need this review, but I've included it here because I think it's helpful for understanding how all the different draft rules for capacity and urbanization are coming together and touching on these different pieces here. So last month, when we talked about Division 8 draft rules, we talked about how the contextualized housing need informs other steps in the Goal 10 process. We talked about the draft rules for development-ready land and housing capacity analyses, as well as how that all folds into the land use efficiency measure work. In Division 24, you'll notice a lot of the rules related to these pieces, especially related to buildable land inventories and land use efficiency measures, were taken out of 0040 and 50. And instead, they're now reorganized within Division 8, which you all saw. And that's so it's a lot more clear where the Goal 10 process ends and where that Goal 14 process begins. So you'll see Division 24, looking at it as a whole, now solely is focused on urban growth boundaries, which better reflects the name of the division. So this is one of the larger organizational changes that I just wanted to highlight before moving forward. And we can go to the next slide. So this is also a refresher, but I think it's helpful for guiding our discussion. And it's something that we will continue to come back to for determining whether or not these rules align with this legislative direction, along with the racial equity framework that Maddie just shared. And so I'm not going to read all these because it's in the bill, but I would encourage us to just continue thinking about this direction, not just for Division 24, but for all amendments that we've shared with you thus far for Division 8 and 21 as well. And so when we zoom out and look at the rules holistically, are they hitting these marks? So I just wanted to provide that framing a little bit before we get into the weeds of the draft rules. Next slide. Thanks. So yeah, on that note, and with those considerations in mind, we're going to now dive a little bit deeper into some of the major changes and key topics within Division 24. This won't cover everything, but we'll for sure hit on the highlights, including UGB study areas and constraints, estimating parcelized land and comparing sub areas, including public facilities and fair housing choice. And then also UGB exchanges, which we just talked about in our last meeting, but we do have a couple updates on that section of rule that we'll share. And so this will follow a similar format of our meeting on Division 8 rules. So we'll pause after each major topic for discussion. And I think we can get into our next topic. Okay, so our first topic is returning to natural resource and hazard constraints in the UGB study area. And you'll notice quite a few changes from the last version that was shared. We've taken a lot of your previous feedback to heart, so I hope you can see that reflected in this version for the rules on 0065 subsection 4, which I'll get into in the next couple slides. It was also important to continue allowing flexibility for local governments, excluding constraints. So you'll see we haven't altered that piece. And then one new addition that we've made is adding notification and invitation for consultation with tribal governments to inform the evaluation of land within the study area. So I'll also get into that in the next couple slides. So the previous version of draft rules we shared proposed adding additional hazards that may be considered, including liquefaction, wildfire, channel migration, coastal erosion, and volcanic hazards. And so you'll see in the draft that we've pulled a lot of that language that we've previously proposed out, and instead replaced that with a catch-all for any other hazards that a local government would like to consider in the analysis, so long as it's identified in a comprehensive plan or development code. For example, a city could adopt a local wildfire map as part of their comp plan if they wanted to use that as a basis for excluding certain at-risk areas. A city might also have a natural hazard mitigation plan or policies adopted as part of their comp plan they could rely upon to make that decision. So even though we've pulled that language out of rule, it doesn't mean that a local government can't consider those things. They just need to back that up with their comp plan or development code. And so what we're trying to achieve here with this change is that, one, it still adds that additional flexibility for local governments to consider other hazards besides landslides, flooding, and tsunamis, while also ensuring more legal certainty if a local government includes or doesn't include additional hazards beyond what is listed here. Okay, I think we can move to the next one. So in the previous version of draft rules on this topic, natural resources, there were amendments specifically on the types of habitat that may be considered in the exclusion of land in the preliminary study area. So you'll see here on the slide how we took that language out and instead are intending to focus more on guidance and best practices for considering and mitigating impacts to wildlife. And so thank you again for those of you who provided feedback on this topic. It was really helpful for refinement. And one new addition that we made here is under H. And this is in response to coordination with tribal governments that has been ongoing as part of this rulemaking. And in particular, the identification of significant natural or cultural resources was identified as a place where input could be especially impactful. But the rules in their current state were limited to resources that were mapped in a state or federal inventory, which is really limiting, especially if a tribal government has their own data or inventories of cultural resources, for example. So I'll talk more about the proposed process related to this topic for notifying tribal governments on the next slide. So under Goal 5, tribal governments who are interested in notification of UGB amendments will receive notices prior to the initial hearing of a proposed UGB amendment, which is towards the end of the process. And as I mentioned, as part of this rulemaking, we sent letters to all 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon, inviting consultation and coordination on our draft rules. And so far, we have heard from 5 federally recognized tribes that they would like earlier formal involvement in the Goal 14 process. And they would like to be notified at the UGB study area phase. And so this notification is in addition to that notice that happens for the public hearing. This was seen as something that was, it's an additional requirement, but I really see it as potentially beneficial, not just for tribal governments, but also for local governments doing a UGB amendment, because it means they're not finding out information at the 11th hour right before the public hearing. They can receive that information earlier and can know ahead of time if there is land with significant cultural or natural resources that can lead to potentially avoiding, minimizing, or just mitigating impacts to those resources, while also factoring that into the information that a city would consider when they are establishing that final study area, and then again estimating capacity or yield of that land when comparing sub areas. They have that information right out the gate. And then not to mention, tribal governments may also want to coordinate on housing and growth planning in a way that is mutually beneficial. So the proposed process outlined here on the slide is that notification of the preliminary study area would be sent to tribal governments with ancestral connection to the land, and there is a list for that. The notice would include a map of the preliminary study area, an invitation for consultation and coordination. There would be a minimum 35-day response window if tribal governments wanted to opt in. And then if input was received, the local government must explain how input was incorporated, and if not, why not? And just acknowledging that sometimes we receive feedback that is not always actionable, but nonetheless, it should be seriously considered. And so that pretty much sums up all the major changes that you all have seen from last time in 0065, 4, and 5. So yeah, back to you, Steve.
Um, um, yeah, I guess I didn't know if you were going to ask these questions or if I will, but we're certainly ready to open up for questions if anyone has any thoughts regarding the rules that the proposals that Jenna went through. Hazards, natural resources. Damien, go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you. I have a couple of questions on the rule amendments regarding tribal consultation. One is with respect to their consideration of significant scenic and cultural resources. I know the department's been doing some work on Goal 5 amendments regarding the topic of cultural resources. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Division 24 here and how that might bring in Goal 5? And then my second question is just if you could add just some background on the Oregon Legislative Commission on Indian Services of Tribal Governments. It's not something I'm familiar with, but I'm assuming they have a website I could go to learn more about what they do and how we might work with them.
Yeah, thanks, Damien. I will try my best, and I can, if I'm unable to answer all your questions, I will direct them to the correct person. But in terms of the connection to the Goal 5 cultural areas rulemaking, there were rules adopted last year. I believe they're continuing to be refined this year. So prior to the initial evidentiary hearing for the proposed UGB amendment, a notice would be sent to tribal governments, and that is the time when that input would be received on significant cultural resources that could be ancestral burial sites or other types of cultural resources, for example. And so that information would then be used to inform the Goal 5 inventory. There are a couple places, I think, where there's also a connection to Goal 5. Where these rules are being proposed is in 0065, and that's in the establishment or evaluation of land within the preliminary study area. It may be the case that input is, hey, there's cultural resources here, but we're not saying you need to necessarily take them out, but you should assume it's a future Goal 5 resource. And so for that reason, when you're at 0067 estimating capacity, you should assume 0 capacity. So that can be helpful for that part of the analysis as well. But that's and that can also be used when comparing sub areas in the SE analysis as well, when you are thinking about potential or future Goal 5 resources and how you may estimate capacity or efficiency of land in those areas. And then your second question on LCIS, yes, there is information online. They do maintain a list of all tribal governments with ancestral connection to the land. I'm happy to connect with others, our tribal liaison, to provide more information to follow up if that would be helpful. But we're also intending to develop guidance related to this, so that should be helpful for local governments who are newer to this process of sending notification to tribes.
Okay, no, thank you very much. That helps.
Thanks, Jenna. Brock, why don't you go next?
Oh, I'll let Heather go real quick. Oh, sorry. Heather,
Yeah, just go ahead.
Okay. One, I thank you guys for the changes. I really like the change for the hazards. And I like the change in now 8E for urban or rural reserves. Just a flag, there's a typo there. You're just missing the division number in that citation, but looks good. On 10, and Jenna, this is what I emailed you about before, and so I'm not sure if this is the right time to bring it up, but just the connection for cities that have an existing urban reserve, and if something there is impractical to serve, doesn't get brought in, and then in the next round, since it gets excluded from the UGB study area, it's automatically re-added to the reserve. I don't think there's a problem with it being in the reserve there, as long as we're making accurate assumptions about the capacity that it has. Again, kind of a bigger conversation that has a couple of rules, but just a flag there. And then on 11, we still have that land use efficiency measures piece that's in there. I'm just wondering if you guys have any data on kind of the PAPA process with the UGB expansion, right? Like if there's an individual property owner that wants to be included in the UGB, how often that happens, generally how many acres you're looking at. And also just kind of like, I'm not really sure how that gets applied. Is it land use efficiency measures that have to be applied throughout the entire UGB? Is it just to the lands that are added? Is it something in between that? So a little bit of clarity and maybe some data there would be really great.
All right, thanks, Brock. Let's see if some of that comes up throughout the rest of the meeting today. Jenna, did you have anything specific you wanted to respond with?
Well, I was going to say that our next topic will get into a little bit more of that impracticable to serve, and so I think we'll hold that off on that for now. But thanks, Brock.
Heather.
Thanks. So I had a question on 65.4 little b big D. So thank you also for broadening that and just saying, if there's hazards identified in your in a comp plan. I had a question about, it says, or if hazards identified in a development code. So is the thought, just thinking about this being land that is outside of the city's jurisdiction. And so if it's identified, is the thought that if it was in the city's jurisdiction and your development code would otherwise have restricted it, then you can assume that. Is that the thought with that?
Right. Yeah. Once
Okay.
it's brought in.
Okay. Great. And then let's see. We had a couple of comments about just further definition about, like, on 4CA, what does it mean to be published? But maybe that will be in the guidance, and similar with the new 4H about lands being identified by tribal governments as not suitable, and that they're consistent, more clarification on what that means to be suitable and significant. But it sounds like maybe there's some more information about that in other rulemaking. And then I think I will reserve my comments about consistency between urban reserves and and UGB expansion for the next part of the conversation because it's kind of all together. But I'll just note that we met with some staff on Friday to kind of go through that a little bit more, the prioritization scheme and definitions and all of those things. And so I'll just talk more about that when we get down the road on this later in the meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Martha?
Thanks. I have one question that might be really dumb, but I'm asking it anyway, and then one quick comment. So looking at the new language about notifying the tribal governments, the way this is written, it implies that there's some sort of list somewhere with the Oregon Legislative Commission on Indian Services. But I guess, is there a map also associated with that list? Like, is it just assumed that you call the state and say, hey, I've got this, we're looking in this general area in Clackamas County, and what tribal governments should I be contacting? Like, how do you know?
Yeah, it's not a dumb question, Martha. So thanks for asking it. And yeah, I mean, this is a new process for a lot of folks. So I think guidance will absolutely address that. And the list does have that geographic component to
Okay.
it. So that would help inform. You wouldn't be sending it to all 9 federally recognized tribes, just the ones with connection to that particular area.
And so I guess that it's assumed this is a pretty easy thing to do. You contact the state, you get the list, and there's contact information. And so it's really not a whole lot of additional work for a jurisdiction. They're sending an extra notice out. Like, it's not a big deal, right? Is that sort of, am I characterizing that kind of correctly?
I don't think it should be a big deal. And it could be the case that you send notice and you don't get a response. And
Well, yeah, that's always the case. There's always that risk. Okay. And then I had a comment on, I didn't realize we were talking down this far, number 10, sub 10, I guess, in 065. I don't think we talked about this before, where if you're excluding land that's impracticable to serve, that suddenly it becomes an urban reserve. That caused me a little bit of angst. I mean, what if a city doesn't have an urban reserve? Then you're adding some acreage and creating an urban reserve that may or may not meet the definition of an urban reserve, which has to have 20 to 50 years of land supply, and go through all of this other analysis and its own priority scheme. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering where that came from and why that might be important to put in an urban reserve. It just is strange to me. And also it seems like the next time you analyze your urban growth boundary, you're stuck, you have to use your urban reserves first, but then you're doing another, I guess you were doing another analysis to determine whether or not it's still impracticable to serve.
Yeah, more to come on that as we move forward. Go ahead, Maddie.
Oh, is that not part of this section? Sorry.
It's fine, Martha. You provided a very perfect segue into our topic area.
I meant to do. That's what I meant to do.
It was all coordinated. So just on the heels of Martha's comment and on the heels of comments from many others that DLCD continues to receive, not all ideas are good ideas. And this one was not. So we're not going to continue with that item in Division 65, both Section 7, the refinements in Section 7 and the refinement added in Section 10 or subsection 10 of Division 24, subsection 65, parts 7 and 10 specifically. Those two concepts, they had some foundation conceptually, but we're not going to continue to pursue them. So we can strike those sections from your memo. This is sort of a kind of a late breaking topic or a late breaking news flash, just given that the timing of the packet and when everything went out to you. So apologies for any confusion that causes. We will, however, be attempting to continue to seek alternatives for developing more clarity and certainty around impracticability to serve, because we know that this is an integral component to both how a community does and sets their initial study area, and how they make the comparison of those study areas in the Goal 14 location balancing factors. To that end, we'd really like to help cities to provide more certainty there. And one of the ways we've initially thought about impracticability is how different costs might be between sub areas or areas within the preliminary study area, and what might be a good threshold that constitutes separation of those areas that remain in consideration in the study area and those that might be separated out because they are deemed to be impracticable. We've seen a wide variation of how cities consider this in urbanization studies that over the last, say, 10 years, at least the ones that I've read, have all been within the last 5 to 7 years, and have taken this approach where there are certain areas that are deemed very difficult and have complexity related to how they're served. And the question is, how much more does an area need to cost in order for it to be separated prior to the Goal 14 balancing factors? So that might be it. Because this is a new idea and you did not receive it in your packet, I would expect this to be something we could circle back with as a homework assignment or a research topic request, which is if folks can work with their public works staff and understand when land has been or could be removed from the study area due to impracticability, about how much more is it? I in my non-scientific and non-statistical description, I would say, how many deviations does it have to be from the mean or from the average sub area? There are lots of ways to describe that, but that will be a question we'd like to raise. What is remaining within the rules as you see them in your packet is that we will continue to propose coordination of public facilities through the requirement of time certain updates to Goal 11 work. So we do hope that by the time a city reaches their subsequent housing capacity analysis, so if a city determines they have a land deficit, they go through a UGB amendment and add land. We hope that by the next time a city begins their housing capacity analysis, that they will have done the conceptual level project assessment that allows a newly added sub area to be served, and therefore have some confidence in knowing that the amount of capacity assigned to those newly added areas is in fact valid. So that's of particular interest that we'd like to continue to pursue. And though current language won't proceed around impracticability and the validation of cost to serve, and that validation of cost to serve item was actually in section 67, part 9, that we will also not be pursuing, that there are ways to continue to validate the requirement that a city consider both yield in response to the feedback we've gotten from you all as advisory members, and the cost that's associated, knowing that not all of the most inexpensive areas will produce the most housing units. So there might be some areas that may be quite expensive to serve. However, they might have the best potential to produce the capacity or the needed housing units that a city needs. And therefore, we would like to see that continue to be balanced in the Goal 14 location factor analysis. And then finally, the existence of vacant and partially vacant land that is parcelized within certain study areas. This is language you saw from division. This is 0240067. And forgive me for jumping around here. I just wanted to make sure we addressed the things we weren't going to continue with first. But this is in fact continuing on. You provided feedback at CowTac 25, which was about three meetings ago now, related to how to describe parcels less than 5 acres in size and their assumed capacity. One, you identify that there was some inconsistency in existing language, part A of this subsection, noting that parcels greater than 1 acre but less than 2 shall be assumed to have an aggregate development capacity, whereas the first element, parcels 1 acre or less, may be assumed to have development capacity. We'd like to make sure that those two things are consistent. And we didn't hear feedback that folks did not want to count 1 acre or less as only having development capacity of 1 unit. There might be differing perspectives in the room, and we'd love to hear about that. And then the second component being that parcels less than 5 acres in size, so from 2 to 5, may be assumed to have half the development capacity as assumed in the analysis. So this may lead, as some of you all observed in previous meeting, this may lead to a city who selects a sub area that they may bring in more land, that is rural residential exception, into their urban growth boundary amendment, because the capacity that it can provide will be assumed to be half of what other land that is not parcelized could produce. Just as one particular side and of particular note, we had some internal conversation about whether we should cite the section that precedes this, which is part 5, because it had a description of existing development patterns that prevent parcelized land from developing in the context of employment land. And if it makes sense or is more practical not to cite that section, but rather to use the language from it, so that this reads existing development patterns that as a result of existing development patterns, land cannot be reasonably redeveloped or infilled, etc. It's better to use that parallel or mirror that language rather than make the citation, because we're talking about employment land versus residential land. We're happy to make that change, but that's something to consider, and I'd appreciate feedback on that as well. With that, and knowing that a lot of things in my presentation have changed from what you see in your packet, I'd like to open the floor to conversation about, first of all, that relative cost threshold for removing land from the study area. So is it 2 times? Is it 5 times? Is it 10 times the amount of cost that an area really constitutes removal from the study area, for those of you who've had experience in that area? And then finally, do the changes related to parcelization in those text segments, does that meet the legislative intent that you saw and Jennifer provided an overview of at the beginning of the meeting?
Thank you, Maddie. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, in terms of a cost threshold for impracticability, we're not intending to put anyone on the spot. So if people want to think about that a bit and get back to us, that's just fine. There were some hands up and then hands back down. Maybe your questions were answered. Al, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I not quite sure whether this is the next part of the sub-agenda, Maddie, but it has to do with the assumptions about the capacity of these lands for parcelization. And how does that relate to what the housing needs analysis and shows is the need for the urban growth boundary expansion? Because sometimes the expansion is because a jurisdiction can't meet all of its needs for, say, multifamily housing in a given location. Sometimes it can't meet all of its needs for manufactured housing. Sometimes it can't meet all of its needs for single family detached. And so I could imagine a situation where a piece of land that needs to be, parcelized will potentially have either much more or much less capacity than you're assuming at this stage. So where does that get reconciled?
Well, I think that gets reconciled after the point of inclusion in the growth boundary. So this might be the justification, and please, if I'm going out on a limb in the wrong direction, then you were traveling, say so. But my understanding is that a city may compare in the Goal 14 balancing factor process described in Goal 14. It may compare the relative cost and potential yield of certain areas. And perhaps in some of those areas, there's an opportunity to see certain development happen that you just described, different types of housing of particular sizing, scales, accessibility, etc. In those instances, a city can certainly make some assumptions. And I think I've described it as the peanut butter estimate. We assume all of the land is going to have a similar intensity of use, but we know that that's not likely to be the case once it's brought into the urban growth boundary itself. It may not be until public facilities planning is done to extend to that area that a city will truly know what the intensity of use might be for that area that's brought in. And I think if I'm picking up your question, the reconciliation of that happens once a city potentially assigns a plan designation to the parcels, so low, medium, or high density residential, or it could happen or be validated at the point of a housing capacity analysis, when each of those parcels of land are put into the buildable land inventory framework and then evaluated using any safe harbors that are available to them, among other steps.
Well, I think, both the two most recent things that I've had a lot of involvement with, I guess, would be the Bend urban growth boundary expansion in 2016, and then the Portland Metro interim expansions. And in both those cases, the plan designations were concurrent with the UGB expansion. They were part of the justification for it, and they were closely tied and tailored to the needs that could not be met, that were identified in the HNA, but could not be met through efficiency measures or otherwise within the existing urban growth boundaries. You can argue about whether those are right decisions, but the fact is that the choices were made, based upon the idea that, well, we'll take this piece because we can put multifamily housing here, or we won't take this piece because we can't put that there, and that they are related to, well, how important it is for under goal 10 is that for there to be a certain kind of housing in a certain location because of access to jobs or access to other kinds of things. And all that is part of the decision of where you expand your UGB. So I can't see the peanut butter. That's the first time I've heard that term.
Thanks, Al. I think where I've used it in a couple of references as the way that engineers estimate the capacity of a particular area, just knowing that a 16-inch water line can serve an area, and then we assume everything's going to develop at the achieved density of, say, 10 units an acre, but we know some parcels would be 5 and some parcels would be 15. That said, the sizing of the utility needs some relative assumption at that stage to be sized appropriately, or at least begin the process of conceptually planning for that area. I appreciate the comments that you've added, though, and I think there is some reconciliation that a city will go through between choosing a sub area that has parcels that are much larger, say over 5 acres, and choosing a sub area where parcels are a bit smaller, say 5 acres and smaller, and the parcelization of those. This discussion about assumption of capacity or assumption of yield, I think, is meant to speak to the difference between those two circumstances, where one sub area is more parcelized, whereas the other is larger lots, and therefore assumed to have a smoother path through to build in the financing and the mobilization capital required to extend certain utilities, et cetera, that those may have a sooner assumed development timeline than the parcelized land, knowing that parcelization can require some assembly and some other legwork that may or may not be preferred by a jurisdiction. And therefore, we're offering some incentive to look at those parcelized areas a little bit with a grain of salt, in saying you may want to take more of those in because it satisfies better the land prioritization scheme, But in doing so, you might result in a harder time developing some of those parcels as a time continuum. I'll stop there. Hopefully, Al, if you have more questions, I'm happy to continue to explore that line of
Thank you.
questioning.
That's great. Thanks.
Okay, let's
ahead,
keep
Heather.
moving. Yeah, we'll keep moving to Heather.
Thanks for the pieces that are being taken out. Appreciate the responsiveness on that. As far as 6 goes, I feel like 6 and A with the may were more of the safe harbor way, like you can do that, but you don't have to, and now it's you have to assume that. And so I would just recommend on A and B, having those be may. And then on B, existing lots or parcels less than 5 acres in size shall be assumed to have half the assumed development capacity or would have otherwise been assumed development capacity. I'm just missing something there. So thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Go ahead, Damian.
Thanks. So Maddie, going back to the question about comparing relative cost to serve versus yield, how soon do you need some feedback to keep you on your schedule? Because I know if I remember correctly, the draft rules are supposed to be released by the Secretary of State around October 1st.
September 23rd, I think, is our pencils down day.
Okay.
Jenna reminded me of that last week.
Nice,
So
precise.
significantly before that.
Soon is great.
Okay, thank you.
Martha.
My short comment is I agree with Heather, may rather than shall. And my question also was, the capacity, you assume half the development capacity, half of what? That needs to be made clear. That's it.
Thanks, Martha and Heather, both of that preference. I think where we were hoping just to provide some corollary by saying shall, we guarantee that's a legal certainty question. By retaining may or switching to may, it allows the city to utilize that safe harbor. However, it opens the city up to potentially being questioned on that, as far as I've understood. That there's legal certainty in saying shall, but providing a may is an option, and an option leaves the city open to challenge. So that's just something to marinate on as we move forward with the discussion.
Brock, go ahead.
Yeah, Maddie just said everything I was just going to say. I understand where you guys are coming from, Martha and Heather. I think the shall does provide that legal certainty. I think there could be like a large A, if you have quantifiable validation or something like that, then you can assume higher. But also just as a, reminder, this is in the study area portion. Once it's brought into the UGB, that assumption might change. So I appreciate the change to shall. So thank you.
Thank you. Corey.
I just had a few clarifying questions. So appreciate the clarity on sort of what's in and what's out. I didn't hear, or maybe you mentioned it and I missed it, for 65 sub 8. So are there larger changes anticipated for this section as well, based on the conversation around impracticability? Or, sorry if I missed it, just curious about like what might be anticipated for that section.
Great question. I think we're going to need a little bit of time to determine what the direction is for addressing sections, formerly 7, what will be 8 after some of the amendments that came before it in part 65. And as to the magnitude of changes and how we approach the question to either provide, I think we'd like to provide some certainty. I think this group has asked for certainty around impracticability and how the city determines that. There's a lot of, I believe there's an imperative to do so, just based on the fact that the city would rather not be challenged on what they've determined to be impracticable to serve. So providing a safe harbor in that case is the direction we're hoping to move. And I think you'll see, or you heard me say, we're looking for a magnitude of difference, like a price differential between areas. Usually there's a cluster of areas that all are clustered around a similar cost. And then there are maybe some outliers high and some outliers low. Those outliers high, we'd like to provide a threshold for a city to say something like, actually some RAC members have shared in recent conversation, which was, we just want to know if it's 5 times more expensive that we can rule it out. And so that's more or less the direction we'd like to move in. And therefore we're taking recommendations as to what that coefficient might, if you go back to your experience, local governments, and could share what you've seen in recent past that's been successful, we'd really appreciate that information.
Great. Okay. Thank you. And sorry, I just had one other question, clarifying question. I don't know how much time to spend on it because it sounds like there might be further changes here in section 8. But the first big B, I didn't really understand what that was trying to describe. So the new language is the relative cost of facilities and services to provide feasibility comparison of service and area alternatives. So is this about doing an additional analysis, right, of what you're describing, of sort of like it's this expensive to serve this kind of area, and then there's other alternatives about what that cost would be? I just found this, I don't know if other folks experience this, I just felt like I wasn't clear on the wording here about like what the actual thing was, like what, so the determination shall be based on an evaluation of this piece. So I just wanted to get clarity about what's intended for that one.
Primarily, it was to clarify that big B under little b is the relative cost of facilities and services to, I think there were some words missing from that sentence, to provide feasibility, a feasibility comparison of service and area alternatives. And I'm not sure if that's what ended up in the printed version. If it's not clear, that's because there's not a lot of clarity in it right now, and we will be working to making it more clear. And thanks for highlighting that, Corey.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we have one more topic to go through. Is that we're moving back to Jenna? Is that right?
Yeah, we are. And I think we have 2, but
okay.
Yeah, one of the other topics is just exchanges, which is more of an update. So I think now we're moving into increasing fair housing choice. We've previously been calling this complete neighborhoods, but in terms of the greater OHNA framework and just trying to use existing language in Division 8, what we're really talking about here is fair housing choice. And so we've talked about the approach for integrating this concept into Division 8 rules last month for areas inside the UGB at the point of annexation and zoning. And so we've applied a very similar approach for areas being added to the UGB to help ensure that there is essentially less retrofitting that needs to happen once those lands are inside the boundary. So on the next slide, I have the draft rule language related to neighborhoods serving commercial. And if you remember, the previous version of draft rules on this topic amended the current safe harbor in 8 little b, and that currently exists for small cities when estimating retail and service commercial needs. But we heard from you all concerns about potentially taking any current allowances away for small cities. So instead, we've just created a new separate safe harbor for cities above 10,000 wanting to estimate neighborhood serving commercial to support a residential land need. And we've also clarified and simplified the language in some places to make the safe harbor more likely to be implementable. And then the next slide is my last slide on this topic, I think. So these sections added to 0067 Provide components a local government must or may use in their evaluation of Goal 14 location factors 1, 2, and 3, which are on the slide for reference. This is when comparing alternative locations for a UGB amendment. We talked about these new sections last time, and I know there were some concerns about limiting a local government's ability to take into account other considerations when evaluating and balancing these location factors. We have broadened the language a little bit to make it clear that these aren't the only things that a local government can consider when evaluating these location factors, but it does still link back to Division 8 in terms of connecting to housing land needs for identified types and densities. And then 12 also allows local governments to prioritize areas that have been conceptually planned for affordability and complete neighborhoods. Though there is no longer a specific percentage called out. And then this again is an incentive, not a requirement. But it helps encourage or aims to help encourage fair housing choice in areas added to the UGB, so they don't have to be retrofitted later and are not immediately flagged as a fair housing issue in the contextualized housing need upon inclusion in the UGB. So trying to prevent local governments from having to respond to fair housing issues by preventing them from happening in these places in the first place. But that pretty much sums up this topic. And I'm going to hand it back to you, Steve. We do have the same questions here on the slide for reference, and I think in the chat too.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jenna. Brock?
Yeah. I can't remember if I raised this before or not, but my on 12 conceptually plan to include regulated affordable housing. I absolutely get the intent there. I think we can take regulated out just because our affordable housing need is so large. I think it doesn't make sense to limit it to just regulated, but otherwise I'm good with it.
Okay, thanks, Brock. Martha?
Yeah, so going back up to 0040, when you're talking about neighborhood commercial, and the addition that you included for local government population greater than 10,000, I think it's fine. It makes me like a little twitchy when you use language like roughly equal to 5% of the net buildable acres. You're gonna get cities in the position of trying to define roughly equal to. I mean, I think it just needs to be a little more certain there, like no more than up to 5%. That's fine, or something that's a little more definitive. But then earlier in that section, I had a couple questions, and I know it's not something you talked about, and I don't know if we're going to cover it later. Under the land need, first of all, there's a huge area, number 8 has all been struck. And my question is that because that's a piece that's located somewhere else? Or do we need to talk about the removal of some of these safe harbors? And hopefully that's an easy question. And then the second question is about the addition under 4B for Metro. It's confusing to me a little bit because it talks about the determination of 20-year residential land need for an urban area has to be consistent with the allocated housing need. But then in Metro, you're saying it doesn't have to be consistent with the allocated housing need. It's just with Metro's coordinated population forecast. And am I misinterpreting this? Because all of the jurisdictions in Metro also have an allocated housing need, and we have to all do the housing work consistent with that. That was kind of a question. That was a question. Am I misinterpreting?
No, it was. There were two questions. There was one on the removal of
Section
safe harbor language in 0040 And I'm wondering if Karin could just provide a little bit more context on why.
Yeah, there used to be a series of tables for determining safe harbor around housing needs, housing type mix, and housing densities. You would have seen all of this, well, you see all of this struck, and it's probably the second version, and both the first and this second one, it was struck. And where that all moved to is now in Division 8. There's a section in Division 8. Rule 100 is your housing capacity analysis. And with the Department of Administrative Services providing needed housing allocations, you no longer need a safe harbor to determine your housing need. You're allocated how many units you need by income level. And in the contextualized housing need, for those of you that have been following along the housing actions work group and some of the NAPTAC work, the needs and production work group last year, there will be a safe harbor for a housing type mix. So all of that was here in Division 24. It no longer makes sense to have it here. Some of this is obsolete now under the OHNA policies, but Martha and others, please refer to Division 8, Rule 100, and the safe harbors that are provided there for these pieces.
Okay. Thank you. I suspected that, but I did not spend the
I
time
know,
to try to track that down
It's hard to
because,
follow. There's
you
a
know.
lot of moving pieces.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that.
Opportunity to remind it. Yeah.
And
I
then
think
the
there were two
second,
other questions, Martha. I
There was a
apologize.
question about Metro, and
Metro.
I know Ted, you had your hand up, so
I'm happy to help if Karin would like that. This was at my request, this change.
go for it, Ted.
Oh, I'm so sorry,
Oh.
Ted. It's not coming to mind. Please bail me out.
Sure. Martha, this was an edit that I requested. Division 24 is all about urban growth boundaries, and as you know, in our region, Metro manages the urban growth boundary for the region. Our individual cities don't have their own urban growth boundaries. And so the language that worked for the rest of the state, where cities were going to base their need assessment on the allocated housing need that comes from the state, didn't work for Metro because we don't get an allocated housing need, though our constituent cities over 10,000 do. We still have a statutory requirement to produce our own regional population forecast and do our own housing needs analysis. So this is just reflecting our current practice and current statutory requirements.
Great.
That's right. And I'll
Thanks.
just add, it was credit to Jenna. She did walk me through that. So Ted, you had made that request. We had shopped it around and I double checked it with Jenna, who verified that this was okay. And that's why I don't remember it. So thank you. So we vetted it internally, and that's where the request came from. And it's in the statute. There's a specific statute, Martha, why Metro is still using their 20-year coordinated population forecast. So it's statutory.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. Heather.
So on the section 48C, I agree with Martha about rephrasing. We were actually going to suggest no more than roughly 5% of the buildable area, but I see what you're saying about the roughly. So maybe just no more than 5% of the buildable area, because the city may want to plan for less than 5%. And as it's written now, it sounds like it has to be exactly 5%. And then for 6711, because this refers to housing types, which is now defined, I just wanted to make sure that we aren't saying that we have to look at, how ADUs are going to be accommodated in an expansion area. Like, we're not needing to get to that level of detail. I think what I'm familiar with is when we're looking at an expansion area to address housing need, we're looking at comprehensive plan designations and assuming a certain percentage of housing mix level housing types, and maybe one level below that are occurring in each plan designation that you're assuming. But I certainly wouldn't, hoping we're not trying to, I just want to make sure that it's clear that we're not getting down to an even smaller level. And so I don't know if it needs to refer to as specific to the definition or a different definition that makes it clear we don't need to get to that level of housing type analysis. And then for 12, appreciate the addition of being able to consider areas that were conceptually planned for affordable housing. I was actually going to suggest keeping regulated in there and removing the specific AMI. But I think you could also remove both regulated and AMI and just say affordable. That would be the most broad. Because I think the intent is, yeah, trying to get at whatever your community's need is for the broad spectrum of capital A affordable housing. Thinking about when conceptually planned would occur, I had a question, like during urban reserves, cities cannot designate land for different uses, right? Because it's still outside of a city's UGB. And so is the intent with 12 that conceptually planned for complete neighborhoods or affordable housing would basically be happening kind of at the same time that you're doing this UGB analysis or doing the locational factor 3? Because it seems like it would be unlikely that a city would be doing conceptualized planning for land that's outside of their UGB before they're in the UGB analysis. But I could be wrong. So that was just a question I had.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. So I heard a couple questions. The first one related to the types, and that is outlined in Division 8. And our colleagues in the Housing Actions Work Group has been more closely working on housing types, but it does not get to that super granular level of detail. It's more higher level, single detached, middle housing, multifamily, that sort of thing. So it is more general. And then your second question on 12, conceptually planned, yes, that would happen at the UGB amendment phase. And the thinking is that if you have a developer, say, that is conceptually planning for an area, the city wouldn't be doing that work, but that would be something that they could consider when they are balancing and thinking about those different factors.
Got it. I remember we talked about this, and I was thinking specifically that about from the city's perspective, but that's a helpful reminder that it could also be from the actual property owner. Okay, thank you.
All right, let's work through these last hands because we still have one more topic to go, right? Jenna? Yes, okay. Go ahead, Damien.
Thanks. Going back to 00408, I had a question about the one of the notes in the call out box on page 9 of the materials. Has the staff done any further thinking about a safe harbor regarding linking this to the EOA that they would be adopting or amending, or is that going to be left later for guidance?
Yeah, thanks, Damien. And I know there was a previous comment about adding potentially in rule language that an updated EOA, economic opportunities analysis, would not be needed to use the safe harbor. And that's something that we're still considering the impacts of. If we were to add that in rule here, would we need to add that in other places? And would that just kind of snowball? So the current thinking right now is that would be probably best for guidance, but we're definitely open to feedback on that if further clarification needs to be made in rule too.
Let's go. I know we'll go to Beth. Cotton, I know you came off mute for a second too. Beth, go ahead.
I will say that a lot of cities don't do an EOA at the same time that they do a housing study. So so that might be tough to do.
Thanks.
To require.
Thank you. Al?
Yeah, just briefly that the way the balancing factors have been applied is that they are generally considered to be pretty amorphous, and I have some concerns about whether or not a court would be very receptive to something that excluded anything from the balancing process that would be theoretically covered by one of the four factors. And as far as the housing part of it goes, I think the real issue in each case is goodness of fit with the housing needs analysis. And that's the way I've seen Metro approach it with its recent UGB expansions, which were quite specific as to what would be going on in those expansion areas, and Bend as well. They use percentages and things like that, which allowed for subsequent master planning. But they did not prescribe whether land would be regulated, unregulated, that kind of thing. They looked at location, housing types, and affordability with the breadth that's actually in Goal 10. And I don't think you can, narrow it that much further. So.
Okay, thank you, Al. All right, with that, let's move to our last topic, Jenna.
Great, sorry, couldn't find my mute button again. So I'm going to walk you all through some recent changes, and I actually am just noticing I didn't get all the changes, but no worries. As Damien stated, September 23rd is pencils down. So I will walk you through what you're seeing here and then what you can expect to see come the publication on October 1st. Great. So last time we met at our previous meeting, CalTAC 27, which was a couple weeks ago, we talked about retaining some options there for continuing to exchange only buildable land for buildable land, or the more broader option that as long as it's residentially designated land, go ahead and exchange that out, and being able to exchange out land that is not inventoried as buildable. So it may or may not have been inventoried as buildable, but if you want to exchange that out of your UGB, you can do that. So you'll see under 3A that has been simplified quite a bit to avoid that confusion. Then I think folks were saying, I think in the existing rules, it said that the local government must apply the appropriate land use designations. And it didn't specify like which local government. Are you talking about the city or are you talking about the county? In most cases, it's the county. So we've added that word appropriate. Your appropriate local government will be applying the residential designation for land going out, or whatever designation needs to be applied. And if that's the county, that would be your appropriate local government. And then if I go down to 4, that word should also be there. So my apologies, it should read the same in 3 and 4, that it is your appropriate local government that is applying those designations for land going out of the UGB and being exchanged out. I think last time we met, we talked about employment land and public land, and folks were like, well, it's quite a bit more simple if you just refer to it as non-residential, because you have an entire subsection on residential. And then down here is everything else that's not residential. So you'll see that reflected as well. And then Heather, you mentioned that we met on Friday, City of Eugene and DLCD staff. And so the idea that there's a land prioritization hierarchy in Division 24, I think under Rule 2, maybe sub C, and there's a very similar mirroring of the land prioritization hierarchy in Division 21. I think Rule 3, and there's ways to simplify existing rule language. If we just look at it, it's a bit verbose. There's some work we can do there. And then how do we have the two divisions really reflect and mirror each other a little bit more? So we walked through some recommendations that City of Eugene had sent to us previously. We asked the project team, so we've got our consultants putting their heads together and are kind of walking through that. And then we've got some internal recommendations for that. So you don't see that, Heather, reflected in this holistic Division 24 because we just met on Friday and this was published prior to that. But I wanted, for the benefit, Heather, I wanted the rest of the group to know that DLCD staff will be working on that up until September 23rd when our pencils are down. And then for UGB exchanges, Ted, at our last meeting, you posed a couple questions and Kevin and I put our heads together and I don't have clear answers. So we're still working through some specifics for questions around when Metro does a UGB exchange. Their UGB is unique in their Metro region. So Ted, we'll work through those questions. We've noted them. Please expect follow-up from us and we'll get you some more specific information on that. That's brief, but that is about all I did within a week's time from when we met last to when this got published. I had maybe 3 or 4 days, and that's where we're at.
Amongst many other things, I know. Brock.
Yeah, I just wanted to circle back to something that Damien brought up at the meeting a week or two ago about the coming in at a higher zone capacity than what's going out. There's a number of rules that are implicated in this, both in Division 24 and Division 8. And so just to kind of walk through the process. So a city goes in, they do their CHN, right? They determine how much of each housing type they're going to need. And then when they are swapping land out, so that land gets taken out. UGB land has to reflect the CHN, so they have their UGB in a way where it's currently pre-swap aligned more or less perfectly to say like this is how many acres we have for low density, medium density, high density residential, etc. If you are taking out low density residential land and bringing in, middle or higher density residential land, now you have a deficit of low density residential land to accommodate the housing need that fits within that density range, right? So it does create a bit of a problem in terms of capacity for specific housing types. If we're bringing in land that is higher than what was removed, because maybe it no longer meets, minimum density standards or something like that. So just wanted to follow up on that because I know I didn't say a whole lot after Damien gave his comment last time, but I do think that's something that needs to be looked at here, and I'll provide more in written comment.
Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, if a city needs to swap out low density, they can swap in at the same or higher. And that might be a choice they need to make to say, hey, we need more low density. This, for whatever reason, we don't believe is going to develop within the planning period. Let's swap out for the same density.
Yeah, and I mean, in theory, they could, bring in something higher and then down zone another area, I guess, if that's allowed. But yeah, but it would create, potential if they went over on that higher side.
Okay, thanks. Ted.
Thank you. I'm still sort of struggling with the overall frame for this. It was discussed how this was a way for cities to remove land from their urban growth boundary because it has environmental constraints. I just don't understand why the appropriate avenue for that is not accounting for those environmental constraints in the buildable land inventory and proceeding with your housing capacity analysis. And if you have a need for an expansion, you can demonstrate that. I think there are some consequences as well of shifting from the buildable land terminology to residential land. I don't know what the analysis would be that we would rely on. The proposed language talks about referring to the most recent analysis of land need, but if buildable land is not something that's being considered anymore, then I don't know what we're assessing. So it feels to me like this is opening a door for expansions of UGBs where there's a net increase in buildable land without any real analysis behind it. And then also tied to the shift from buildable land being the coin or the common currency to residential land. In our 2023 exchange, we specifically looked at exchange candidates because they still had their rural land use designations, though they had been in the urban growth boundary for 20 years. So the use of residential, non-residential, commercial, industrial really doesn't make sense in that context. So I don't know how we would use this system anymore if there is a shift away from buildable land.
Not to answer your question with another question, but that's exactly what I'm going to do. Does it broaden it to additional flexibility that you find some liability within, or does it actually limit your options for the Metro UGB to exchange land out and bring land in?
I think both. I wouldn't know how to address this issue of, you know, basically exchanging residential land if we're looking at lands with rural land use designations. I wouldn't know how to address that. And then I think this question of, you know, is there a net increase in buildable land as a result of the exchange, introduces legal liability for jurisdictions that rely on this if they don't have an analysis to support a need for more buildable land to back it up.
Yeah, I can see both of these points, because I think maybe it's a little bit of a tweaking of the word that the residentially designated land going out, whatever land is coming in needs to be designated for residential. And not all cities are designating land outside of their jurisdiction. So that urbanizable land may or may not be designated. So I see where you're coming from there. And then as far as, oh, I wish Derek from Newport was here, because I think he has a very specific example in their UGB, but I feel like the city of Astoria too. There's a wildlife refuge, that's the use, but it was designated residential. It sits in their UGB. I have no idea why it's designated residential, but it's been obligated to be inventoried as part of their buildable land inventory for a long time. But they're adamant it's a wildlife refuge. There's no way we're ever going to be able to really realize the capacity. And so there's more than one example. Like I said, Newport has one. There might be a couple other coastal cities. It's not exclusive to the coast, where they have, since acknowledgement, large pieces of acreage that they know they will never have access to for residential capacity, even though it's designated residential and it's been inventoried. And that's what they're looking to swap out. I wish I had more examples off the top of my head. You're right, Ted, there are none of those examples in the metro region that we are aware of. But it does not feel like a UGB expansion to swap out something that they've been inventoried per the rules, but have no realistic residential potential or capacity there. So that's kind of been our rationale for the department.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks for the question, Ted. Let's go Beth, and then Alexandra, and then Martha, and then we need to wrap up.
That example that you gave, Karen, is very, very common, if not the exact thing. So for instance, I know in Corvallis, for instance, they have land that is in what do you call it? I've lost the word, but it's essentially held for non-development uses, staying rural, staying undeveloped, conservation easements. Those are really common land that is now in parks that was residential before. So I think the intention is to allow for swapping out of that kind of land and bringing in roughly equivalent, the same amount of land now that would be useful for housing development. I see your concern about the word buildable, though.
Alexandra.
Similar to Beth, I kind of have some more, I guess, anecdotal, not like more direct contact with it, but some areas east of the Cascades, you may have things that were designated as part of buildable lands, as part of like inventoried residential lands at the time of the creation of the UGB. And for whatever reason, I could, much like the Newport example, no idea why that was included within the UGB when it's largely always been kind of wildlife refuge, or it's been for a long time, kind of why it's been designated residential, but also things that have been designated as like residential that are far better used as farmland, kind of a thing, is the example that we see east of the Cascades of it's designated, you could use it as that, but if you have better land that's not going to have some kind of conservation efforts or things like that, swap is just the easiest solution for most of our, especially smaller jurisdictions.
I'm gonna go back to Ted. Looks so you can
Yeah,
respond, Ted. Yeah.
Just very quickly, under this new system, my impression is that jurisdictions are going to have to do a housing capacity analysis either on a 6-year or 8-year cycle, depending on if you're in the metro region. So it feels like there's an opportunity to update these inventories, and that's what this is an issue of counting lands that shouldn't be counted as capacity.
Yeah, I think so. And to Alexandra's point, we have 241 cities and 74 of those will be obligated to do every 6 to 8 years the analysis. The others won't and may want this option for exchange. Let me sit on that one. We'll mull it around even more than we already have, Ed, because it's helpful. It's helpful to have it reiterated and bring it back to the forefront.
All right, Martha. Thanks for your patience.
No, that's fine. I mean, I think that maybe this is one of those instances in which there does need to be different rules for metro versus cities with their own UGBs. And I think one of the distinctions is that when there's a city with its own UGB, when land's brought in, it's already, I think there is a plan for that land. And so you know if it's going to be residential land or employment land. Whereas there is a lot of land in the metro urban growth boundary that is not, we don't know if it's going to be residential or employment land. And so I think what Ted is saying is that how do we know if we're pulling residential land out, right? Just because it's zoned rural residential is pretty meaningless in the context of this kind of an analysis. Some of it's still zoned farmland. It doesn't fall under any, well, I guess it'd be non-residential. And so classifying land like that in the metro area is a little bit difficult. And so maybe this is a good place to look at some different rules, because I don't think I don't disagree with the idea of being allowed to do this. But I think that there is an issue with calling it buildable land, but also with calling it residential land, because we just quite frankly, in some areas, don't know what type of land it's going to be.
Yeah, and I know I'm going overtime, Steve, so I'll be really brief, but Heather, it'd be good to talk to you guys as well, because City of Redmond has their urbanizable land that's not designated. It's an urban holding zone. I've got to get the language specific enough that you're not getting an intentional expansion, but I need to get it general enough so that it works for a Redmond or a Eugene, and maybe it's okay. I'll go back. I'm not at square one, but I might go back to like square 2 or 3.
Well, speaking of squares 1, 2, or 3, it felt like we are a few squares ahead on most of the topics we discussed tonight, and we're getting down to minor tweaks. If we were to take a poll, I have the feeling that we'd be in that 2, maybe some 1s, and not in the 3 that we need major overhauls. So progress, and that's due to, in large part, to the contributions of all of you. So thanks for that. Okay, a few dates to go over, and please, DLCD team, listen carefully to make sure I get them all right. Our next contact meeting, I believe, is Tuesday, October 21st. Is that correct? Yes, seeing some nods.
I just put all the dates in the chat.
You did. Okay, great. Yeah, you've got them all. I was just looking for those. Yeah. So as mentioned earlier, the rules get published on October 1st. October 23rd is the LCDC hearing. October 29th is the next RAC meeting, and then the public comment period closes on November 7th. So hopefully everyone tracks those dates and can participate to the extent that you would like to. But as for this committee, thanks again for your review of the materials and your thoughtful comments as we have these conversations. And we will see you in about a month, right? October 21st. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.